Hello and welcome to Digging for Britain, the programme which brings you this year's most exciting new archaeology. In this show, we'll be looking at highlights from all the digs, we'll get some in-depth analysis, and we'll be looking at treasures from the past. Hey! Once again, over the last year, archaeologists have been unearthing our history in hundreds of digs across Britain.
Go on! Fantastic. It's a two.
They've gone to extraordinary lengths to uncover secrets from the past, retelling our story in a way that only archaeology can.
It's in perfect mint condition.
Amazing.
Well done.
I was right.
And our archaeologists have been out filming themselves, so we have been there for every single moment of discovery. And then we're coming back here to Norwich Museum and seeing if we can really make sense of the new discoveries.
In this series, we'll be touring the country, and tonight we're in the southeast. First, we hear about incredible finds at a Bronze Age Pompei in the Fens. We unearth an amazing hoard hidden in desperation as Queen Budika's tribe hunted down the Romans. And we discover weird burial rituals, revealing the secrets of Anglo-Saxon motherhood and childbirth. Norwich Castle Museum, originally a Norman fortress, is now home to the archaeological riches of the southeast. Norfolk is the treasure capital of England, and each year 20,000 finds are reported to the museum, more than in any other county. Finds like the Haysborough axe. Dating to 500,000 years ago, it comes from what's become one of the most important prehistoric sites in Britain. And the Snettisham hoard, the richest Iron Age treasure ever found in this country. Our first story takes us 70 miles away from Norwich, right into the heart of the Fenlands. Must Farm in Cambridgeshire is being called the Pompeii of the Bronze Age. Preserved in the wetlands of the Fens, this site is giving us an unparalleled glimpse of prehistoric life, going back over 3,000 years. In the past, archaeologists have uncovered ancient causeways running through the Fenland Basin, making them think that Bronze Age people saw this watery landscape as a sacred place, only visiting it on special occasions. But now, on the edge of a quarry, they're finding evidence of industrialised fishing, opening up a whole new perception of life in the Fens. It's something never seen before, and more importantly, they believe it could stretch for miles. This is archaeology on a massive scale. Mark Knight from the Cambridge Archaeological Unit has been analysing some of the most recent finds from a lost side channel of the River Nene.
Often we dig sites of the sort of Bronze Age in this region and we find one vertebra and we say that that's evidence for fish in the diet, or we say that maybe it's a chance find. But we're just finding lots and lots of fish, and we're finding things like pike and perch and carp and smelt. And then when we went to excavate the channel properly, we then found about 20 really beautifully preserved sort of sock-shaped baskets that are definitely fish traps. But alongside those, we're finding these sort of chevron-shaped wattle fences, forming these weirs across the length of the channel, regularly spaced along the entire area of the channel that we excavated. And there's a real sense here of an industry, perhaps, rather than maybe something sort of ad hoc and stuff. And remember, we've dug 300 metres, and we're looking at a channel that we can trace for at least 10 kilometres. If it's typical, then, you know, we're talking about hundreds of weirs and thousands of fish traps being set within its course.
Mark, what an extraordinary sight. I mean, the preservation there is beautiful.
It's stunning, yes. It's one of those sites where you don't have to do a lot of sort of describing to visitors and things. They can see for themselves just what's there.
And it seems that fishing was going on an almost industrial scale then.
It's a surprise, I suppose, because we don't normally find fish bones in the faunal assemblages, so there we are finding weirs and traps everywhere.
So we know where these people were working. There must have been tens, hundreds of people possibly working in this industry. So where did they all live?
It's a really good question, and it's my opinion that basically they're living in the Fens, they're living on the peat, they're living on the rivers, and we've got good evidence of that, and the sense that it corresponds to a phase within the dryland sites where there is no settlement. So it's as if they're colonising the wet, basically, and the traps and the weirs are part of that new landscape.
I think we've got some more from this incredible site. As the team continued their excavations in the side channel of the Nene, they started to find metalwork.
So we dig 300 metres of channel and we come up with a whole host of swords, spears and metal objects.
Finds like these are rare, but some have been found on other Bronze Age sites, leading to theories that they were ritual offerings for watery deities. But Mark believes the weapons recovered at Must Farm had a more practical use.
The sheer quantity of swords and spears and the sort of sense that this is a landscape that appears to be sort of newly colonised, we're starting to think that maybe the metalwork being found in the wet places was actually an indication of just the scale of occupation of the wet spaces themselves. So they were living on the rivers or they were living on the marshlands themselves.
Some of these swords also have nicks on the sides of the blades, signs of violence.
Swords like this were used to sort of slash things, and the idea was that if you were hitting someone, you'd get sort of marks on here, but if you were defending, then you'd get marks down here. And we've found swords with those consistent signatures of conflict, I suppose, of them being used in anger rather than just being sort of symbolic objects. You arrived being prepared to protect yourself at the very least, or maybe even upset people that were already in that landscape.
So Mark, you think these really were weapons, they're not just symbols?
I just find it impossible to think that all those swords and all those spears were just purely there for show, basically.
So it seems like quite an idyllic environment, but perhaps not as idyllic as all that.
Yeah, I suppose like any landscape that we occupy as human beings, there is this sort of, I don't know, tendency to sort of want to hang on to what you've got, basically. And you get a real sense within Fenland that there is a territory, the idea that this is our place.
So do you think this really was Bronze Age prime real estate then?
I get the feeling that basically this is the place to be, and essentially that the sort of switch has come from Stonehenge over to the main rivers of eastern England.
Right, we've got some more from your amazing site. The River Nene is an extensive wetland which was first created 4,000 years ago when sea levels rose. But the people of Bronze Age Britain took this climate change in their stride. In fact, they flourished here. Evidence of this resourcefulness is backed up by a significant discovery. Not one, not two, but 8 log boats. And unusually, virtually intact. The boats have been moved to Flag Fen and are now being conserved using the same methods that helped save the Mary Rose.
There's a real sense here that we're seeing the vessels of transport, of movement, maybe of fishing, but also of about the actual occupation and the settlement of Deep Fen. The first time we actually step off dry land and get into the deep sediment, we find 8 logboats in 300 metres of channel. So either, we found the one spot in the whole of Fenland, or this is representative of the rest of that landscape. And if it is representative of the rest of the landscape, then the scale was astonishing. And the sense that There are thousands of these boats up and down those channels and river courses, and they represent that sense of mass settlement of that wetland.
We often think that climate change always has a negative impact and that the wetlands would have been an inhospitable environment for humans, but Mark has other ideas.
What we're suggesting from our evidence is it was the opposite of that. It was no longer an impediment to settlement, and nor was it something that sort of made you retreat. It was actually a landscape that you were quite keen to inhabit. And the people had the imagination to find ways of getting into that space. And they maintained that link to the channel as well, as in the English Channel and the continent. And I think that's really important.
It's just extraordinary. I mean, those are quite big boats that you're finding there.
Yeah, one's 9 metres in length, so.
And why do you think they're at the bottom of the river? Is it anything to do with the swords and the other depositions?
You've got to remember there's 1,500 years of history in that channel, so, and there are boats throughout the sediment. So it's not necessarily the same story for each of the boats, but some of the boats are pristine, and they seem to have a connection with the weaponry. And it's quite often in the Fens that you find boats close to swords or spears. So there seems to be a connection there. And at the same time, there are fragments of human skeletons within the channel as well. So if we wanted, we could form a sort of triangle here of swords, boats and bodies, and we can start maybe thinking about an association with maybe burial or something like that.
This is fascinating because when I think about Bronze Age burials, I think about kist burials, stone-lined, crouch burials.
Yeah,
I don't think of people having burials in water in their
but
boats.
I think, remember, this is the later Bronze Age, and if we try and find the burial record for that period, we can't. It's conspicuous by its absence, and I like that idea that we're not the first people to suggest that people were being buried in rivers. It's been, the Thames is famous for its Bronze Age skulls and things like that, and the association with swords and things. Maybe some of those boats, their pristineness is the fact that they had a body attached to a sword in its scabbard and things, and it was, you know, sunk in that river and things. So these are the possibilities that we're coming across.
So you're pushing archaeological boundaries as well?
Yeah, I think so. I think you feel like we're on a slope to the bottom of the North Sea, and on the way down there we're going to explore the whole of the British prehistory, and I think that's the excitement about it.
Must Farm, with its amazing wealth of finds, is the perfect example of how new archaeological discoveries can completely change our ideas about the past. And while Bronze Age people rose to the challenge of the fenlands, creating a highly productive fishing industry, it seems that they were also respecting the watery landscape with ritual offerings of swords to the gods. Like this stunning Bronze Age dirk or long dagger back here in the museum.
So Tim, what have you brought in for us today?
What I really wanted to show you is something that the museum has just acquired and is an absolute star object for showing you something like ritual from the Middle Bronze Age.
Incredible, it's huge. And that's the blade along there, is it, that edge?
It is, it's the blade edge, but one that's never been sharpened, so it's deliberately made, but not with the intention of ever using as a weapon. And the same goes for the hilt here. It's never actually been hafted on.
Why is it so large?
Well, it is because it's purely for ceremony. We don't quite understand why, but it's one of only 6 in Europe. There are 2 from England, 2 from France, and 2 from Holland that are now known. Something that suggests there's a North Sea trade link, perhaps.
So it's real proof that in the Bronze Age there really was a proper organised trade network across Europe.
Absolutely. But the interesting thing about this is, in being the second from England, both of them are from Norfolk.
I mean, it looks like a very sturdy object. How come it's been bent?
Well, we often find with Bronze Age weapons that they seem to be bent or deliberately destroyed before they're placed in the ground, and that seems to be part of the ritual killing of the object itself. So again, it's putting it out of commission, and again, it's part of, presumably, the ritual involved in why you have them in the first place.
And just 50 miles from our museum, Colchester was once the beating heart of Roman Britain, until an uprising led by a British warrior queen. In various eras, Budika has been described by historians as a bloodthirsty savage, a freedom fighter, and even a feminist icon. But it's archaeology that's revealed the harsh realities of the Budikan revolt. In AD 61, Colchester was the first town to feel the full wrath of the Queen and her Iceni tribe. Archaeologists digging behind a Fenwick store in the town centre are unearthing a story of one Roman woman whose house was burned down in the fighting.
It's quite amazing when you stand in the excavation and you could almost feel you're standing in the burnt-out remains of her house, because the floors are all scorched red and black, and the walls are all reddened, big lumps of clay block wall lying on the floors.
The team are trying to trace the last moments of this house and its owner. Back at the Colchester Archaeological Trust, Project Officer Adam Whiteman's taken up the trail.
This is the remains of charred foodstuffs. We found 1 or 2 wooden planks, which either come from some shelves or a table, and spread over the top of those were foodstuffs that have been preserved as they've been carbonised. Here we have, these are burnt figs. You can see all the little seeds in those. These are burnt dates. And this selection here has been hand-picked out of this soil sample. And these are a selection of peas and small wheat grains and possibly some various other sorts of legumes.
Were these blackened foodstuffs the interrupted last meal prepared by the lady of the house?
Very touching to see it lying there, scattered, blackened on the floor.
And just outside the incinerated home, what appears to be evidence of a violent death.
These were discovered actually on the edge of a Roman street. These 2 bones appear to exhibit injuries. This mandible here is missing a slice of bone there. And this tibia is also missing a piece there. The cuts appear to be quite clean, look like they've been done by a sharp blow. They're sort of more comparable to a butchery mark on an animal bone rather than the mark of a shovel or a spade from the clearance of the building. So chances are these bones actually tell us even more of a gruesome tale than just having been spread on the side of the road.
Behind all this violence was Budika. Originally, she was an ally of the Roman invaders, but they annexed her lands, flogged her, and raped her daughters. In 61 AD, a revolt swept across the east. The Romans who weren't murdered fled for their lives. The team believes that this house was right in the path of the rebels and that the woman who lived here hid something before she left.
What we found in this excavation was an extraordinary discovery of this desperation act. This well-off lady had taken all her precious jewellery and buried it in this tiny little hole, just big enough for her to stuff it all in and cover it, in the hope, I suppose, that she was going to be able to go back and recover it after the big emergency was over. But of course that never happened.
Carefully unpicked in the lab, the jewellery, now known as the Fenwick hoard, had lain hidden from the Iceni, and for almost 2,000 years after that. Earrings, armlets, chains, and rings. One woman's treasures. A poignant memento. But history suggests a grim fate for the owner of this hoard.
Dio Cassius is the one that tells us what happened in Colchester to the women. The noblest, for which we can read the richest, and that would be this lady surely, were rounded up and taken to sacred groves, groves which were dedicated to the British goddess of victory. and there they were horribly sacrificed.
They hung up naked the noblest and most distinguished women, and then cut off their breasts and sewed them to their mouths, in order to make the victims appear to be eating them. Afterwards, they impaled the women on sharp skewers run lengthwise through the entire body. Tim, that sounds horrendous, but this could just be Roman propaganda. But the archaeology is telling us something unequivocal, that there was a revolt here.
The archaeology is certainly telling us that there's a destruction layer that occurred at exactly the time that it's documented that the revolt took place. And so it's not unreasonable to assume that that destruction layer is associated with the documented historical revolt. That's right.
Why have you brought these particular artefacts?
This is exactly the reason. If we look at these, they're two very interesting artefacts, one of which is from the Castle Museum, and it's a fragment of a horse statue. And the head here is on loan to us from Colchester and Ipswich museums. And it's actually a copy of a head that's the original of which is now in the British Museum. And it's the head of Claudius, the emperor who undertook the invasion of Britain. And they seem to be from the same statue of the Emperor Claudius, an equestrian statue.
Were they found in the same place?
They weren't. The head was found in the River Ald at Rendham in Suffolk in 1907 by a boy splashing around in the river.
Right.
And the part of the horse was found by a metal detectorist in Norfolk in 1979. So 37 miles apart.
So how can you tell they're from the same statue then?
Well, that's a good question. We can't be absolutely sure, but metal analysis shows that there's a very low lead content in both of the bronzes, and it suggests that they are one and the same. It should also be added that there are no other fragments of statue like this in East Anglia, so they're a rare bird to start with.
So do you think the statue had been deliberately destroyed then and smashed up after the Budika revolt?
Almost certainly. The head has been wrenched off, and the leg also seems to have been torn up. And I think it's interesting that they haven't been melted down and reused. They've actually been deposited. And with the head in the river, it could easily be something like a sacrificial offering to a river.
What happened after the revolt?
Well, unfortunately, it doesn't have a very happy ending for the Icenian people, because after burning Colchester, going on to London and Verulamium, they're defeated in the West Midlands and Roman rule is imposed. And in particular, it's probably imposed very severely in East Anglia, which were considered very dangerous and rebellious areas.
From the story of treasure hidden by one desperate woman swept up in a bloody revolt, we move to a dig in Oakington that gives us amazing insight into the place of women in Anglo-Saxon society. Even today, childbirth can be a risky and worrying time, but it was far riskier for our ancestors. A team from the University of Central Lancashire has spent the last 5 years investigating life and death in an Anglo-Saxon community. They returned this year and made some truly remarkable discoveries. Here's their dig diary.
So we are in Oakington, and this is the 2014 excavation. This is our main trench. We have a significant early Anglo-Saxon cemetery, which includes 124 graves. They date pretty much to the 6th century AD.
But what's unusual about this cemetery is the number of infant burials.
We appear to have little clusters of infants' graves around the edges of the site. And we found something earlier on this week that I think demonstrates that very nicely. These are fragments of an infant's legs and skull. Out of our population of 124 individuals, about 30% are infants. This is extraordinarily high, so it's really interesting to have that, and we had to start questioning why.
What's also unusual about this site is that the team has been finding a large number of high-status female burials.
In this space here, in 2011, we excavated grave 57. This is an adult woman, and one of the first ones that we found that year. She was a wealthy burial, buried with a large cruciform brooch at her neck, two smaller ones at her shoulders, and a full set of beads and purse. What was really interesting about her is that in her pelvic area we found a whole series of very, very small bones. And it turns out that these were an infant. She was pregnant when she was buried, and this was probably the cause of death. A really tragic story, but a very interesting piece of the puzzle.
A surprising find. But this was only the tip of the iceberg for Duncan and his team.
In 2012, we had a large trench just where I'm standing now, and excavating just here, we found a woman buried with a complete cow. Now that's a completely unique find. We haven't found anything like that in the whole of northwestern Europe for the 6th century AD. It's really interesting because the cow has cut marks across its lower feet, which suggests that it was skinned. It also had no tailbones at all. So this is not a romantic bovine burial with a furry, cosy animal in their pet, but rather it's a sacrificial offering, a meat gift placed in the grave so that she could host parties in the next world.
Wow, what an incredible find. What did you make of that, Duncan?
It was incredible. We didn't expect it at all. We got very excited because you don't find large animals with women. And I don't know of another example in England. I don't know of another example from the early Middle Ages in Europe at all. So it's unique at this point.
So how does that burial there fit in with all the other female burials that you have in the cemetery?
OK, so that one is mid-6th century. And it's probably got a little mound over the top of it and a whole load of burials all the way around it. And it becomes a central focus point. And we have a number of other similar burials like that, without the cow, of quite important female burials which seem to be focal points throughout the cemetery. And so it's a succession of important women that were part of that 6th century community at Oakington.
So what did you find this year? Let's take a look.
This is an adult female. You can tell from the shape of the pelvis here, but also from the skull shape as well. What's sort of interesting about this one is that this yellow pipe here has been drilled through the grave from a different position, and the people that put it here never saw it. This is part of the services for Oakington Village, as we're right up against the road. So this is often where lots and lots of services go through. And it's amazingly lucky that when they put this through, they missed all of the objects that she's been buried with, and did very little damage really to the skeleton. They really couldn't have done that better, even if it was completely accidental.
What's even more intriguing about this grave are the objects buried with the woman. She seems to be of high status.
We have here a small long brooch that would have been worn on her shoulder, and there's another one on her shoulder just here to hold up her dress. And then this large one would have been on a large cloak, and this is face down. So it would have almost certainly have been wrapped up in the cloak and then rolled on the top of the burial. So it's really interesting that the positions of the objects there can tell us how she was dressed. And almost certainly she was wrapped up in a cloak before the soil was placed in the grave.
So what you've got is an Anglo-Saxon cemetery with a large proportion of women, and a large proportion of women who appear to be very high status, and a lot of infants as well, compared with other cemeteries. What's going on?
That's right. So, proportionally, we have almost all of our female burials are furnished, whereas only a small handful of our male burials are furnished. So they are signifying, or they're making a point of the female burials much more than they are the male burials.
Meaning that all the females were buried with combs, beads...
Exactly, and the brooches on the shoulders and at the neck there as well. But then with all those infants buried in groups around the female burials or on the edge of the cemetery, that population is too high. And so what we're thinking at the moment is that we have a female-dominated matriarchal group, and their daughters are going out and marrying other communities. But potentially, that's quite a scary thing. You're going to a new place, a masculine place, and it's a bit scary to give birth. So they're maybe travelling back, and they're bringing their children back to their mother's hall, to their sister's hall, and they're giving birth there. Now, I don't know whether we can see that archaeologically, but certainly what we can see is those connections, those relationships, and that's why this is a central place in the Cambridgeshire landscape.
So cemeteries like this are not just telling us about individuals, they're giving us information about the structure of society at the time.
Absolutely. The structure of society, its organisation, the movement of people across quite wide areas as well. We're not talking about walking around the corner, we're talking about travelling for some miles to come to this community for this sort of activity.
And the first cow in an Anglo-Saxon grave.
And have you finished the cemetery now, is that it?
Now, we've excavated as much as we possibly can. Yeah, so that's the end now excavation. All of it is now post-excavation, and we hope to understand more and really question some of these things in much more detail.
To get a sense of the wealth and high status of these Anglo-Saxon women, there's no place better than Norwich Castle Museum. It's a treasure trove of bronze, silver and gold. Like this Anglo-Saxon bracteate or pendant.
The particularly important thing about bracteates is that when they've been found in Britain, they've only been found in female graves or as single stray finds. But the particular focus of this is as a hoard. It's the first time this has ever been seen in Britain, whereas normally in Scandinavia, where these bracteates are typically found, they're buried in hoards.
I mean, the workmanship on these is absolutely incredible. But what do these show us?
Well, bracteates are ultimately derived from coin designs, Roman coin designs, because coins would have been worn as pendants themselves. And ultimately, the design became copied, and the copy became copied, and so on, until you end up with a very basic design. And on this bracteate, you can see a warrior with a sword raised behind his back, fighting off two animals.
So what kind of women would have worn these bracteates? I mean, they're solid gold. They look pretty expensive to me.
They are expensive, and therefore it's a sign that the person wearing them is of high status themselves. And from another point of view, it also says something about the person or people that were able to bury an entire hoard of these in the ground to give them up and not come back for them.
This summer, archaeologists have been digging in Kent, looking at what they suspect is a royal palace complex, just the sort of place where people would have been wearing all of that Anglo-Saxon finery. Leminge in southern Kent is now a peaceful English village. But in Anglo-Saxon times, this was a bustling royal centre. For the last 3 years, right in the heart of the village green, dig director Gabor Thomas and his team have uncovered evidence of medieval life and Bronze Age burials, but what they really want are signs of Anglo-Saxon royalty.
Right, it's a lovely rim fragment.
And they're beginning to find clues to personal wealth and status.
So this is a bit of metalwork that came up yesterday. It's a small piece of copper alloy, and it's in the shape of a bird. It's decorated on both sides, which is quite interesting. This is just a hint of what's likely to come once we start excavating into the features.
I thought it was modern, and then I was like, no wait, what? Yeah.
I don't think we've ever had that's so recognisable like that with the base.
So we don't get a lot of bases at all of glass. It's a quite large fragment anyway for a piece of glass. We usually get rims and bits of the body, but not the bases, really.
The team believes these glass fragments were once part of elaborate drinking vessels, like these replicas. But more importantly, they were used by high-status Anglo-Saxons, possibly even Kentish kings. And what they're uncovering now could be the proof they need that kings were here.
We've had a really good breakthrough today in this particular trench where we're looking at an exposure of around about 20 metres. So this building's about probably in excess of 20 metres in length. We've also got a width for it somewhere around 10 metres in width. That's a super-sized hall for the Anglo-Saxon period. You only get these scale halls on royal palace complexes.
So, Garbo, you really think you have found an Anglo-Saxon royal hall?
Without doubt. I mean, the structural evidence says that very clearly. You only get buildings on this scale, on this type of site, and it's worth saying that this is incredibly rare archaeology. Only 2 other sites of this period and this importance have previously been excavated, including the iconic site of Yevering in Northumbria. It was the first place that open-area excavations were undertaken in the 1950s. But normally these sites are found through aerial photography. They show up as crop marks. But on this site, it didn't even show up on geophysics. It required really open-area excavation from the start and really some small clues that there might be something of this magnitude just under the village green.
So what were the clues that made you dig there?
Well, there was a documentary reference that describes Lyminge as a royal ville or a royal complex, but none of the archaeology relating to that earlier period have ever been found before. And that's what we hoped we would find under the village green, and we hit the jackpot. It was amazing.
And as well as this amazing royal hall, you found an extraordinary rubbish dump. Right next to the 7th century royal hall, the team opened up another area after geophys revealed a mysterious blob. This turned out to be a midden or rubbish dump with incredibly rare finds deep within it. Archaeologist Alex Knox explains.
Today we have begun excavating what we call the dark blob in Trench 1, which is full of Anglo-Saxon artefacts. And we're also hoping to find out if there's anything lying underneath this dump of rubbish.
As the team dig into the midden, high-status finds start coming thick and fast. They uncover decorative brooches.
Yeah, it's in perfect mint condition.
Amazing.
Well done.
Bronze hairpins.
It's an absolute monster. Is that the end? That is the point, yeah.
And a copper alloy mount.
Probably would have been attached to perhaps a leather belt around the second half of the 6th century.
These Anglo-Saxon fashion accessories predate the royal hall by a full century. A very early insight into the culture of this settlement. But the next finds begin to reveal something quite different.
I've seen metalworking residues, iron tools and implements.
It looks relatively modern, actually.
It does.
Probably isn't that modern at all.
And as the metal finds grow, the team begins to suspect there's more to this dump than meets the eye. So they dig a trench right through the middle to investigate.
What's appeared at this level very clearly for us is an area of burning, or what archaeologists would call a hearth. We've also got consolidated lumps of what's likely to be the superstructure or the dome over a furnace or a kiln, showing up nicely on this side of the trench. This evidence here fits very nicely with the materials that have been dumped in above this level. We've recovered a lot of smelting slag. So we have an early Anglo-Saxon version, if you like, of a metalworking installation, of which we've only got one other example, really, from Anglo-Saxon England, which is 2 centuries later. So this is hugely significant archaeology. Now we've got to try and refine our understanding of what's going on in here a bit better by the end of the season.
So, Gabor, this is some of the earliest evidence we have for metalworking then in Anglo-Saxon Britain.
That's right, and there's different types of metalworking as well. So we've got ironworking represented, but also in front of us here is a selection of objects associated with bronze casting. We've got a fragment of a 2-piece mould just here.
What object do you think that would have been?
Probably a piece of jewellery. It may have been something like a bronze buckle or perhaps even a brooch.
So they were really churning out this really high-status bling jewellery, if you like, here.
That's right.
But that's not all you had from the midden, is it, really? Alex, what have you got over there?
We're just washing some of the animal bone that's come out of the midden. Just endless amounts of feasting debris, cattle, sheep, pig, enormous amounts of animal bone to go along with all this metalworking.
So you've got these myriad finds from the midden. What does it all mean?
Well, we have a really interesting association here between feasting on the one hand, as represented by our animal bone, and all of our glass vessels. I think what this represents is a period when specialised manufacture of high-status objects is happening within the sphere of elite residences. And we haven't previously seen that on other sites. This is very new.
So it's really adding as well to our knowledge of the whole of Anglo-Saxon Britain, really?
Absolutely. It's telling us what elite culture was like in this period and its intimate relationship with the production of luxury items.
So once again, archaeology reveals an unexpected twist. A beautiful royal residence, and right next door, making their very own luxury goods, a very early Anglo-Saxon factory. Next, we head to Basing House, a place synonymous with battle and bloodshed. Basing House in Hampshire was a key site in the Civil War. It was a royalist stronghold, and the parliamentarians were keen to take it.
And this year, archaeologists have been digging up evidence of the house's bloody history, bringing us face to face with one of English history's most controversial characters.
In the 16th century, Basing House was one of the most impressive Tudor complexes in the country. It was built on a Norman fort, known as the Old House. And right next to it used to sit a huge mansion, known as the New House. This is where the team have put in a large trench.
It's actually a fantastic archaeological site to work on. We took off the topsoil and the walls started to emerge almost immediately.
Documents of the time tell of a final battle that took place here in 1645, and the team are looking for hard evidence as to just how this mighty fortress fell. Heading up the dig is Chris Elmer.
So we're midway through the dig and we're finding quite a lot of evidence now of the Tudor range that lies behind us. And what we're interested in is thinking about what happened in the Civil War with the destruction of the house. And in fact, recently we've found some pretty interesting evidence because we've got really nice sort of lead musket balls showing us balls that obviously were available as the ammunition of the day. But more intriguingly, we're also finding the evidence for musket balls that have impacted. They've obviously hit something or someone because they've splatted and they've gone into this very strange shape. So we've got a theory that what we're looking at is the evidence of the conflict that was occurring, the battle that was occurring, and we're finding the real evidence of that with these musket balls and with the end product you're seeing here.
2 years before Basing House fell, it was placed under siege by the parliamentarians as they fought the royalists, led by John Paulet, the Marquis of Winchester. Over 2 years of digging, Chris and his team have mapped out the defensive lines of the now vanished Great House.
As we're walking round the site of Basing House, we've just come to the gun platform, and there were several gun platforms erected during the Civil War. This one, we've got a replica of a Civil War saker, a cannon, which will be pointing out towards the parliamentary lines on the other side. There were several gun platforms all the way around the ringwork area, and in a sense, this was the first line of defence during the Civil War for Basing House.
By surveying the surviving buildings of the Great Tudor complex, the team has also identified battle damage.
We've now come inside the Great Barn. I think the most amazing example of destruction, if you like, that we can see, where there would have been cannonballs coming through the roof and then actually hitting the inside of the wall. So we can see there's a great big scar in the wall at the top there. There's another one further along.
With Charles I supplying men and money for the house's fortification, it seemed invincible. And after 2 years of trying to batter Basing House into submission, the parliamentarians were getting nowhere.
So, Alan, who did they turn to?
Well, the Lord General Fairfax sent down his second-in-command, a man who might be quite familiar to you. Here he is, Lieutenant General Oliver Cromwell.
Ah, the man himself.
This is a life mask of Oliver that was done a few years after the siege of Basing House. As you can see, somewhat plumper than a serving soldier would have been in those days, but it does give you a really good impression of what he looked like.
So if this is a life mask, this is a mould of his actual face?
Indeed, that's Oliver. You see, the eyes are rather odd because they were applied afterwards, because obviously he would have had his eyes shut when
It's extraordinary and slightly weird. I still don't think that Oliver Cromwell on his own could have conquered Basing House, so what did he bring with him?
He had a bit of help. He had 3 regiments of foot, several regiments of cavalry, about 5,000 or 6,000 men in actual fact, and some really big guns, including an incredibly big piece of artillery, a cannon royal. That fires a 64-pound ball, and here's an illustration which gives you some idea of the size of the thing. And because of the condition of the roads, sometimes it would take up to 60 horses to pull these down the road, or 60 oxen. Once this was applied against the castle, it doesn't really stand a chance.
So this is bigger than any of the cannon that were actually in Basing House?
Oh, yes, much bigger, yes.
I would not like to have been a royalist facing up against that cannon. So how did they fare?
Well, I think that's what the archaeologists are about to find out.
The new house guarded the entrance to the postern gate, the way into the citadel of Basing House. The team believed that this was the weak point for Cromwell to exploit, and he would have thrown everything he had at the Tudor range, including the firing power of his massive cannon royal. In the last week of the dig, they find evidence to support their theory when they uncover the remains of a bridge which connected the new house to the old.
The postern gate that led into the old house is directly behind us, and this area that we're excavating was part of the entry point for the old house. And what we're thinking is this is the point where in the Civil War the parliamentarians broke through into the old house. And so, can we see anything there that tells us about that final battle? Can we see anything that tells us about their entry to the old house as well?
Previously on this same site, archaeologists uncovered several skeletons around Basing House, which they believe were defenders from the Civil War. But the most significant discovery was the remains of one particular soldier, found by the postern gate, who seems to have died defending this weak spot in the final siege.
To our surprise, after we'd finished excavating the gateway and had a narrow passageway, we saw there was a ditch which we sectioned, and in that ditch we found a skull which had been decapitated. There were some of the vertebrae were there in situ, and there was also a great sword cut on top of the cranium. And so that had to be really the head of one of the defenders of Basing, and as such really must have got there during that final assault on 14th of October 1645. And it's so rare for an archaeologist to be able to find something and say, this happened on this particular day, but we feel confident that that was the case there.
Of the 400 royalists defending Basing House, 100 were slain and the rest taken prisoner, while the great Tudor mansion itself was set on fire.
People could hear the cries of those who'd taken refuge in the cellars, screaming to be let out. But there was no one to let them out. There was no way of reaching them, and so a good number must have perished in that way.
Finally, Cromwell's brutal attack had led to a decisive victory, and he quickly sent word back to London. "I thank God I can give you a good account of Basing. We have had little loss, many of the enemy our men put to the sword. Most of the rest we have prisoners, amongst whom the Marquis of Winchester himself. Your most humble servant, Oliver Cromwell. Archaeology is a complex jigsaw puzzle, drawing together everything from skeletons to swords, and from riches to royalty. Amazing stories which are helping to rewrite our history.